Hi, I'm David Luong, and you're listening to Trek Rant, the Star Trek podcast where I rant, rave, overanalyze, and obsess about all things Trek. As I've mentioned before, this is just a quick mini podcast which I'll be doing sometimes solo, sometimes with a guest, and basically as a supplement to the main Kid Clown Kicker podcast, our Geek Roundtable podcast, which you can also find on our YouTube page or at our official website, www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com. Today I'll be talking about Star Trek Voyager, the sometimes loved, sometimes maligned Star Trek spin-off series. It's kind of weird. Basically, I run two Star Trek clubs, and I get this kind of very split opinion on the series. From a lot of people, I'll hear it's their absolute favorite of the Star Trek series. I even had someone tell me that they thought Janeway was a significantly better captain than Kirk and Picard. So you get your huge fans of the series. And then on the other side of the fence, I'll get people who say it's their least favorite Star Trek series because they find these storylines to be derivative, very repetitive, they don't like the characters, that sort of thing. So basically, yeah, I do get this whole split opinion on the series. I, for one, fall under the category as to actually liking the show. By no means is it my favorite of the series. I think my favorites still are the obvious frontrunners, TOS and TNG. And I will admit I do love Enterprise. That's something I'm saving for a future podcast episode. But those would probably be my three favorite series: TOS, TNG, and Enterprise. But Voyager, I'll watch Voyager and I'll completely enjoy what I'm seeing. I like the premise of them being lost from so far from the Alpha Quadrant. I do love the premise. I like the characters for the most part. I did like Janeway quite a bit as a captain myself as well. I don't think she was the best captain by any means, but she was certainly serviceable. More than serviceable, she was a fairly good captain. And I even like the look of the show. I like the design sense of the show. So count me ultimately as a fan of the show. That said, as much as I do like Voyager, I would say that of all the Star Trek series, it was the one that didn't live up to its true potential. By that, I mean with the aforementioned premise about them being lost and far away from the Alpha Quadrant, and this whole idea of a split crew of Starfleet officers and Maquis rebels, it could have reached heights that other Star Trek series couldn't. But for one reason or another, it leaned towards being somewhat, and this is probably going to sound more negative than I intended to, but it ended up being somewhat more generic, somewhat more derivative than it should have been. So keeping that in mind, here's some ways that I would have written Voyager so that it would have reached its potential. First off, and it's the thing I just mentioned right now, you had a split crew between Starfleet officers and Maquis rebels. So that means two separate crews with two completely different styles and views of the universe, views of the world. And I felt that was something that they didn't really touch upon enough in Voyager. There could have been this great ongoing rivalry between the Starfleet half of the crew and the Maquis half of the crew, where they were constantly butting heads, not just in terms of personality, but in terms of opinions on how to deal with issues, on how to handle new encounters, how to handle first contacts. And by the way, when I say that, it doesn't always mean, oh, well, Starfleet are the good guys and the Maquis have to be the bad guys, or vice versa. It could have been a situation where you see that both sides could be in the right, they just have very different viewpoints. And by the way, when I say conflict, I don't mean that in a way that it necessarily needs to be they're complete jerks to each other either. I'm going to use TOS as a really good example. McCoy and Spock, there's a lot of conflict between those two characters because they had two very different views of the world. But ultimately, you got the idea that A, they respected each other professionally, and B, they were ultimately both good people, quote unquote, good, however you want to define morality. They were both the good guys. And I could have seen that being something you did with the Maquis and Starfleet, where both sides are still inherently good. They still want to do the right thing, but they just have different views of the universe, which would make total sense because the Maquis was a group that splintered off to go try to do what they felt was right. So it wouldn't be like they would turn villainous all of a sudden. They would just disagree with a lot of the policies that Janeway and, by extension, Starfleet would have. It could have also helped build the two lead characters, Janeway and Chakotay, a little bit, showing them as both the leaders of their respective camps, still respecting one another ultimately, but not afraid to butt heads when necessary, not afraid to have a duel with one another occasionally on how to handle things. Instead, I felt that Voyager, for the most part, Chakotay just fell in line with Janeway way too often for that particular character in the way that I felt he should have been written as the head of a splinter rebellious cell like the Maquis. Another point I want to bring up with regards to the Starfleet Maquis rivalry, along with them having conflict, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be jerks to one another. I don't think that necessarily means that the tone of the show necessarily needs to turn dark. I'm not saying that Star Trek Voyager needs to become Battlestar Galactica all of a sudden, or even Star Trek DS9, which could occasionally be a darker series in terms of Star Trek series go. It just means that there's conflict between the characters, and conflict can help build characters in an overly positive way. Again, I'll use Spock and McCoy as the example of two characters who had conflict with one another, but the show never necessarily needed to turn dark because of that. So that's point one, that I would have liked to see more of the Starfleet Maquis rivalry and the split in the ship's crew be underlined more within the series. The other thing I would have done to help Voyager reach its true potential, I probably would have dropped a few of the characters. It seemed like a fairly large cast. If I'm not mistaken, I think they had it was like 8 or 9 main characters as of the beginning of season 1 with the whole crew. And that's a lot of characters to focus on. And I know Star Trek shows in general do have a lot of characters that they focus on because they have a whole large bridge crew. But I think for Voyager, it would have been more beneficial for them to cut some of the fat, as it were. That said, and I don't know if I'm going to get some heat for this, but the characters that I probably would have dropped would be Neelix and Kes. I get why they were written into the show, to kind of serve as guides to the new quadrant they were in, but ultimately I felt that it would have helped the show more if the Voyager crew were truly lost, if they were truly strangers in a strange land with no one who they could really fall back on. And even then, if Neelix were supposed to act as a sort of guide to the crew, I don't think he always did a great job. I think he really started out as a guide, but ultimately just became the annoying comedy relief. And I say comedy relief in parentheses, quote unquote, because ultimately I didn't think he was that funny. I felt he was a lot more annoying than anything. So I would definitely have dropped Neelix and Kes and not even introduced them in the first place, especially because it felt like Neelix was annoying and Kes I don't think they ever actually did anything with. To the point where they did replace her with 7 of 9 down the line. So that's my second point, just drop those two. Next thing I would have done to help Voyager out, I probably would have gotten them some new main adversaries, some new main villains. Basically, I felt that Janeway needed her version of the Klingons. She needed her version of the Cardassians. Something that this is her threat. This is someone who you identify as her villains. Because I think when you say Klingons, a lot of people automatically say, oh, you mean the guys who Captain Kirk fought. Or when you say Cardassians, a lot of people say, oh, you mean the people who, the species who Sisko on DS9 rivaled against. So I felt that Janeway needed that. She needed her main adversary. I know that she took on the Borg a lot, but to me, the Borg are Picard's villain. They premiered in The Next Generation. Picard went through this whole arc where he got turned into a Borg. Picard fought against the Borg Queen in First Contact. So when I think of the Borg, I think of Picard. When I think of Janeway's adversaries and basically her confronting the Borg, I almost think, well, get your own villains, Janeway. And yes, I know someone's going to say, well, the Cardassians didn't premiere in DS9, they premiered in episode Next Gen. And I know that, but the Cardassians were truly fleshed out in DS9. I don't think you got that same thing with the Borg and Voyager. I don't think the Borg were truly fleshed out in Voyager. I just felt that it almost felt like Voyager didn't have its own villains, it didn't have its own strong adversaries for Janeway, so they just picked someone who was popular from the Next Generation canon and just threw them against Janeway. Something I wasn't overly fond of. Now, as to who I would have had rival Janeway, I know there was attempts to create new species throughout Voyager, some adversarial to Janeway, which is a little bit hit or miss, and I think maybe I'm going to talk about that in a future episode with regards to favorite species throughout the Star Trek canon. But I would say that they needed some sort of adversarial group to work against Janeway. Heck, even if it was, again, if I go back to the if I go back to my previous Starfleet Maquis rivalry statement, even if her main adversary was Chakotay, and I don't mean that in that Chakotay needs to be villainous, but even if you thought of Chakotay as kind of Janeway's adversary, that might have been interesting. But in any case, I felt that Janeway just needed her own version of the Klingons, her own version of the Cardassians, someone who, throughout the thread of the show, was her main threat, and that would have really helped the show a lot. Last one I have to bring up, and it's a super minor thing. As much as I like the overall design of Voyager, and I like the look of the ship, I wasn't a huge fan of the bridge setup. And I don't totally blame Voyager on this. I think a lot of this came from the design mentality that was pulling from Next Generation. But I didn't really love how Janeway and Chakotay literally had their seats right next to each other in the middle of this blank space in the bridge. It just felt like more that was I almost called it, when I watched it with friends, I called it like a love seat in space. It's just those two sitting and watching the big screen together. And by the way, just so no one thinks I'm picking on Janeway or Voyager, I didn't even like it when Next Gen, when Picard was sitting next to Riker and Troy with the 3-seat layout. For me, the bridge of a ship needs to just have the captain in the center, the captain's seat in the center, and that's it. Because your attention should be focused on just the captain, the main star of the show, the leader of the ship. There should have just been one chair there in the center that just focused the whole show on Janeway. And I just felt by having Chakotay and her there in the center with their little love seat didn't help her look like a commanding figure, especially because they were in this whole new quadrant. They were in this whole new situation where a more powerful hand on her part, even if it's a visual cue like having her chair in the center, would have helped give you the message that they need a strong captain. Here she is. She's Janeway. That would have helped a lot for me. Again, that's a very minor thing. At any rate, those are just some of the things I would have changed about Voyager. Underline the Starfleet Maquis rivalry, drop excess characters like Neelix and Kes, give Janeway some main adversary on par with the Klingons and Cardassians, who weren't just derivative from a previous Star Trek series, and again, the very, very minor bridge setup issue. Again, by no means do I think Star Trek Voyager was a bad show. I like Voyager, so please, no one get down on me for that. I do like Voyager. I just think it didn't reach its true potential, and I just think it needed some tweaking and improvement to ultimately it could have been one of the best Star Trek series with a few minor tweaks here and there. But what do you think? Am I completely in the wrong and Voyager was already a perfect show as is? Or did I not go far enough? What would you have changed about Voyager? Leave a comment on this YouTube page or visit us at our official website at www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com and let me know what you think. Also, please subscribe so you can receive updates on future podcasts, not just this one, but our other podcasts, including Kid Clown Kicker, our Geek Roundtable podcast, and other shows that we'll have coming up in the future. This has been David Luong, and thanks for listening to Trek Rant.